we moved back to Houston in 1991, in September. We had lived here before, and I was not happy about coming back. And so I knew I needed to immerse myself in things right away. So in September, a week after we moved here, I went to a beach cleanup at Bolivar Flats and met Gretchen Mueller, who was the sanctuary vice president then. You probably know that there were vice presidents in charge of things where we didn't have employees. And so I saw Gretchen again at a State of the Bay meeting. They had just finished studying Galveston Bay to set up the Galveston Bay program. And so I told Gretchen, I said, I'm here, I've got time. If you need help, just ask. She said, I need help. They had just gotten a lease from the General Land Office for 550 acres of coastal property at Bolivar Flats. And they needed to count the birds there 10 times a year. And so she asked me to count birds. So that was my introduction to Houston Audubon and to Bolivar Flats. So it's really interesting that in the 1980s, well, first you need to understand that Bolivar Flats was formed from the building of the North Jetty at the mouth of Galveston Bay. They were trying to stop sediments from filling up the channel, so they built the jetty. And the jetty stopped the longshore current, and the sediments dropped out to the east of the jetty. And that formed salt marshes and beaches and all kinds of things. And the philosophy at that time was that accreted land that grew adjacent to regular land, right, belonged to the state. But so the state, being the General Land Office, felt they could lease us that land, lease Houston Audubon the land. And the reason that we wanted to lease it was because cars drove everywhere. And they would drive through the huge flocks of birds that used it, and they would drive through the least tern colonies. And we had a volunteer named Stenny Metters who started in the 80s with Galveston County trying to get that part of the beach closed that the birds used a lot. And eventually in 86, she got it so we could put a vehicular barrier there, and it was mostly made out of landscape ties. And it wasn't real good at stopping traffic, but it helped some. And that was the only area on the whole of the Bolivar Peninsula that there couldn't be cars. So it's really important to birds. So then they approached the land office about leasing the property. And once we had it under a lease, then we could make other improvements. So in, I think it was 92 or 93, we got the lease to 550 acres. And we built a bigger, stronger vehicular barrier. Fish and Wildlife Service gave us a grant, and we built the vehicular barrier out of power poles that were donated by the power company, and we built an observation platform with signs so people could understand what the different parts of the sanctuary were. So not too many years after that, I got to be, in 1993 actually, I got to be sanctuary manager. In 1996, I think it was, that there was a for sale sign on land that was very close to the land we were leasing. And so I called the realtor, made an appointment to see what the property was, and lo and behold, they were selling land that we were leasing from the state government. So I called the GLO, and they said there had been a lawsuit that determined that if a property owner had not done anything to cause the accretion, that the accreted land belonged to the property owner. So that made it so our leases were null and void. So something else had to be done to protect this area. So we proposed to buy the 176 acres that was next to Redalon Road from Don Suderman, who owned it. And so we had to do a fundraising campaign, and it was interesting. We needed $176,000, and the first $100,000 came from GLO. They had a coastal management program at the time that gave grant money for purchases. So they gave us $100,000, and then they have the birding classic, where they have these teams that compete, and one of the teams gave us their top prize. And so it wasn't too terribly hard to raise that $176,000 because a lot of people cared about Bolivar Flats. And about the same time we had that closing, we had the closing on the piece of property across the street on the left-hand side of Redlawn Road as you're going to the water. It was a guy named Louis Tyra, and he and Andrew Johnson, who was a Bolivar Peninsula person, were going to put Waterworld over there, which was, and the piece of land was like 550 acres around. And the Corps of Engineers said 75% of it was wetlands, and they couldn't build Waterworld. So they needed to do something with the property. And Lewis was old, and his family wanted him to diverse himself of a lot of things before he died. And so the family donated that 4/7 undivided interest in that piece of property to us. So we wound up with like we did what's called petitioning, and that means that you get your 4/7 and they got their 3/7. And fortunately, the fellow that was working with the Johnson family was Sid Bowes, who I had met previously. He was a surveyor on the Bolivar Peninsula, and before he was a surveyor, he did heavy equipment work. And so he said, Miss Winnie, I know what part of that property you want, and you just leave it to me. I'll draw the lines with the family. And he did. He knew what parts we wanted. So we got the wetlands and the salt marsh and the outflow of Beacon Bayou. And the family got the uplands that had pasture for cows. So that worked out very well. So we thought, well, we're okay now. But then several years later, another sign went up saying that land was for sale. So I went to that realtor's office, and it turned out that Boyd Realty, which had subdivided Port Bolivar in the 1800s, was going into bankruptcy. And they had 3,000 acres they wanted to sell. Part of that was the other part of Bolivar Flats. And they didn't, at that time, want to divide the property up. So I just told them, when you're ready, if you are ever ready, we want it. We want this piece. And so it wasn't too long before they called and said, well, they would sell us that side of the road. And that was $750,000 we needed to raise. I didn't know quite how we were going to raise that. Houston Audubon has gone back and forth about having development people, and sometimes we've had development people that couldn't do grant writing. And fortunately, we had Caroline Cowrie, and Caroline took me by the hand practically. First thing she did was take me to a classical radio station in Houston that was owned by Mike Studi of the Brown Foundation. And so we sat and talked to Mike, and he said, I'll tell you what, you write us a request for $200,000. And next we talked to Ann Hamilton at Houston Endowment, and she said, well, you write us a request for $100,000. And that money made it so we could get matching grants. And we got a grant from Texas Parks and Fish and Wildlife Service and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We got other grants for habitat stuff from the Fish and Wildlife Service. But it didn't take too long, really, to raise that actually we raised $800,000 because we were trying to raise a management fund also, because you really shouldn't get land without management money. We've learned that the hard way. So we were able to purchase that piece, and we built the vehicular barrier that goes parallel to the beach. There was only the vehicular barrier at the end of the beach, but now we could keep cars out of the back side of it, which was very good because people used to bring their old roofs and leave them there and stuff. So when we were in the middle of that, I timed out of my being on the board, and so I told them they needed to hire me, so they hired me. And we got all that sorted out, kind of, and the bankruptcy court said, don't you want to buy more of this land? Because they owned another 600 acres across the highway from Bolivar Flats, and that was Horseshoe Marsh, what we call Horseshoe Marsh. There was Horseshoe Lagoon, which was almost totally surrounded by salt marsh. And it's a beautiful piece of property, but complicated because it had been platted for development. It's 4,000 lots. Some of the lots already had houses on it because there were undivided interests sold. And so the bankruptcy court would own like 10% undivided interest in a piece of property, and there would be a house on it. So the bankruptcy court, the bankruptcy judge can make it so that they can sell, the bankruptcy court can sell everything. So we decided, Joy Hester and I were working on that project. We decided we couldn't take all they had left, which they wanted us to do, but they allowed us to do what's called cherry picking. We said, we want this and we don't want this, and we want this and we don't want this, and we tried to keep it contiguous so we didn't have pieces off here and there. And so we were able to get a really good chunk of land. And also we were able to use the donations for the Bolivar Flats purchase that we hadn't already used for matching to match a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant for $450,000. So it's going to cause us headaches forever because there's little in-holdings and there's road right-of-ways. But we essentially were able to put aside a tremendous amount of land at the end of the Bolivar Peninsula. And with the property growth the way it's going now, it's just amazing. And when they did the partitioning of the Tyrant Tract, they took the beachfront and they made that one piece that they cut into 1/4 7ths and 1/3/7. And so we got our 4/7, and the 3/7 piece now is for sale for $5 million. And they thought they had it sold to a developer right before Hurricane Ike, and we wrote a really long comment to the Corps of Engineers about water flow and impact to wetlands, and the developer pulled out, but I don't know that it was our letter that did that. I think it was Ike too. When the jetty stops the longshore current, and the longshore current is full of sediments, and those sediments are full of nutrients, and the nutrients feed invertebrates. So we have really yucky mud that's full of food. And right now, down there, there's probably 6,000 avocets, and I know there's at least 500 white pelicans, and there's probably a couple thousand other shorebirds, and that's because there's so much food there. It has one of the highest density of shorebirds in the Texas coast. So that's why it's so important. And the combination of the marshes there, it supports not just the shorebirds, but we have a lot of herons and egrets and spoonbills, and white ibis are in there in good numbers. And so that's why it was so important to protect it, and to protect it for in perpetuity. And the neat thing is, because it's growing, and because of the way our deed is written, and we know accreting land belongs to the adjacent property owner, our land is growing. It's growing exponentially right now because they're doing beach renourishment at McFadden Wildlife Refuge to try to protect it, the freshwater wetlands from the salt water there, because the beach has eroded so much. And when they do beach renourishment, a lot of sediment gets into the water. And so the water's going down the coast, and it gets to Bolivar Flat, the jetty, and it becomes part of Bolivar Flat. So it's accreting a lot. And our deed was written so that we own to mean high tide. There's not a line that says we own to here. We own to where the tide comes to. So that means if you go down there a lot, which we do because we live near there, you can see our property growing. we lost our signs in Hurricane Ike, and they haven't been replaced. We don't have much signage down there. Fishermen certainly understand the value of it. And there's a lot of wade fishermen that use that area. There's a lot of people that fish on the jetty, and they use that area. So there's a lot of people that know about it that way. We have a webcam, a bird cam that operates down there. And so a lot more local people are learning about it. That's been one of my missions, is to try to help Bolivar Peninsula people understand the special parts of the peninsula. And so that the bird camps really helped a lot. But yes, there's always a need to expose people to the importance of these places. Because, people get irate about the Corps of Engineers protecting all the salt marshes, and yet the same people like to eat shrimp. And they don't ever put the two together. That, if you don't have good salt marshes for a shrimp nursery, you don't have shrimp. So there's a lot to teach people. There are a lot of business people on the Bolivar Peninsula that understand. COVID years aside, the restaurants on the Bolivar Peninsula say that in April, the only reason they make money is because of bird watchers. And those are the bird watchers coming to High Island, which also go to Bolivar Flats. But they recognize that. And we've tried in the last, 10 years to have a very visible day pass. We used to have stickers that went on people's clothes, but then people wear so much polyester now that stickers don't stick. Now we have wristbands, but a lot of, so that when they go into businesses, they know, oh, those are people that are down here for the bird sanctuaries. And so there are restaurant people particularly who know that there's a big input. But right now, tourism on the coast is phenomenal. Building on the coast is phenomenal. And it mostly goes back to COVID, because when everything shut down, people started renting beach houses at a time of year they usually don't, because it was a way to get out of town in a comfortable place where you could you could work down there, because everybody's got a pretty good internet access. So we have our challenges with changing around people all the time, but we keep trying. When I started volunteering in 91, the next thing I did was go to High Island in 92, and I worked at one of the work days with Laura Singleton, they have an award named after Laura. She was a character. And Laura always had a beer at lunch. She was just this graceful woman, but she always had a beer at lunch. I thought that was fascinating. But we had a work day, and it came lunchtime, and she went over to the motel and bought hamburgers for everybody. Now we have Houston Sliger who cooks lunch, and before Houston did hamburgers, we used to have sandwiches or chili or something. But Laura would just go over to pull out her wallet and go buy everybody lunch, which was great. But there was this core of older volunteers. Laura Singleton and Ellen Red were two of them. And then there was Bessie Cornelius. Have you heard about Bessie? People have told you about Bessie. Well, Bessie was something else. I tried volunteering with her for a little while, but Bessie didn't feel you were qualified to do much anything for a couple of years. The first year you could hand people the pencil to sign the visitor's book. And you might be able to hand out brochures. You could do that. And then eventually she might let you hand them the day passes or the patch. Maybe. But she only handled the money. So she would have like 4 or 5 people sitting there doing almost nothing, which I'm not a sitting doing nothing person. So I wound up, I always carried a pair of clippers around and clip trails and stuff. And then when I became sanctuary manager, sanctuary vice president, I made everybody unhappy by cutting out the number of trails, because everything was honeycombed with trails, which meant there weren't really places for birds to feed and get away from people. And so we did that. And then when they had the High Island Initiative and they got the money, the grant money for improvements, there was a lot of stuff that had to be done. they did in the early 90s, like 92 or 93, they built the boardwalks and the bleachers at at Boy Scout Woods. But then when they did the High Island Initiative, about 95 it was, we had a big Texas Parks and Wildlife grant that was really National Fish and Wildlife Foundation money. And so I had to get like 19,000 feet of barbed wire fence up, because there was an old fellow that had been in the community forever that had cows on the property. We didn't want him in sensitive wetlands or the woodlands. So also we wanted to cut down the number of cows he had. So we gave him a year to cut down the number of cows, and we built fences. And so when we got the money, at first Texas Parks and Wildlife wanted us to have 3 bids on projects. And eventually we realized you're lucky if you can get anybody, to be at High Island to do things. And also the board had told me I really needed to spend as much money as possible on the Bolivar Peninsula, because that's really how you impact the community, that people know you're doing things. So someone had recommended a local fellow that could get the job done, and his price came in about the same as the ones from out of town that could get the job done. So I hired him, and that was very interesting, because it turned out he subcontracted it out. Now, in those days, the Gulfway Motel was a very busy place. They had the restaurant there, and everybody went for lunch. They had steam table lunches, and I'm sure they talked about us a lot. Because about halfway into this fencing, I came regularly and watched what the guys were doing. Somebody said, "Hey, Miss Winnie, you hired poachers." I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, yeah, Fred over there, he's been in prison for poaching." Oh, okay. So it turned out this local guy had contracted these other guys. They were poachers. But they did a good job on the fence. But they didn't do wooden fence, and by the parking lot in Smith Oaks is a wooden fence. And I had learned that, you don't pay everything up front. You pay materials up front, and midway through you pay some so they've got salaries. But I held out quite a bit at the end, and they didn't do wooden fences. And the guy that I had hired didn't much like doing fences either. But one weekend I came over, and there's his wife standing, leaning on a tree, watching him build the fence. So I bet she was the one that had to worry about where the money was coming from. So that was pretty interesting. But in 95, we did a tremendous amount of stuff. We planted a lot of trees. Almost every cypress tree in Smith Oaks was planted by volunteers. And they're mostly planted as bare root plants. And when you look at the size of some of them now, they're really good size. We planted thousands of trees. Most of the ones we got were for free, but we did have some that we purchased because we had grant money for it. And we had 4 that were planted at the High Island schools. The maintenance people killed 3 of them. We had some that were planted around the parking lot at Boy Scout Woods. There's nice big oak trees there now, but that was interesting. Texas Parks and Wildlife wanted a picture of a video of the planting trees around the parking lot. And they didn't want us planting little trees. They wanted good-sized trees because it makes a better picture. So I had to get the trees down to the coast. I found trees. I rented a U-Haul truck. We got the trees, took them down to High Island, brought the U-Haul truck back because you can get them for $19.95 for a day. And that weekend we were supposed to do the video, or that Friday we were supposed to do the video, and it rained all day. Texas Parks and Wildlife never came, never did the video. But we had gotten the trees down there. We got them planted with volunteers, but that was pretty much fun. But when you look now at the sanctuaries, Gast Woods particularly, and you look at the trees, it's hard to believe that in 95 they were all planted, most of them as gallon containers. Because the Bolivar Peninsula was pretty much, the early records say that it was prairie, and there were a few copses of trees. And when people got shipwrecked, there's shipwreck records, they would go towards the trees thinking there must be a house there, but there wasn't. And the soil records show that it used to burn about every 5 to 7 years. And a lot of prairies in Texas do. They burn in the summer because of lightning strikes. And that the whole peninsula used to burn. And when you think about how would trees get to High Island, you know, the animals don't carry acorns that far. And birds might carry hackberries, but probably not many. So probably all the trees were planted. In 2005, we had Rita, and that hit High Island and broke a lot of tree branches. We didn't get a lot of rain, but we got a lot of wind. In 2007, we had Umberto, and that we had had a lot of rain before that. And Umberto was a strange one in that it developed right on the coast, and it wasn't a hurricane when we went to bed, but it was a hurricane that had already hit with 80-mile-an-hour winds when we got up. And because it had been so much rain, a lot of trees were blown over, which I hadn't, you learn all these things. And so it wound up with tree companies, both Umberto and Rita. We ultimately had to get tree companies because there's widowmakers that you don't like to leave hanging. Volunteers can do a tremendous amount, and did, as far as cleaning up branches. But the tough stuff we hired people for. And when we got done with Umberto, I said, I'm never, ever doing another hurricane. I'm never doing it. And then exactly 1 year after Umberto, Ike struck. And it's just appalling. And at High Island, it was tree damage. And our sanctuaries are high enough there that we got some saltwater inundation in Smith Pond in Smith Oaks. Clay Bottom Pond, the high one where the rookery is, it didn't get salt water. And that was really interesting because alligators can smell fresh water. And one day I was walking, I was there a lot afterwards, and I looked and there were alligators everywhere, and I counted 75. But I hadn't gone out to count alligators. I just counted. And they were huge alligators. They weren't our regular, 6 to 10 foot ones. They were huge alligators. And they left eventually. But I talked to people, because Smith Pond not only got inundated with like 3 feet of salt water came over it, it also got a lot of petroleum products. Because, there were all the tanks and the wells and everything around High Island, so there were petroleum products everywhere. So I called some people about what do we do? Do we use surfactants? Do we do what? And the guys said that in the soil, there's enough bacteria that can break down petroleum products that they didn't think we wanted to use them, that it would do more damage. And so we drained Smith Pond. Smith Pond used to be the community water supply. So there's a valve, and you can turn the valve and drain the pond. So we drained the pond and closed the valve, and then it filled up with rainwater. And then we got a grant from Ducks Unlimited, and we bought several $1,000s worth of fish, and we put fish back in the pond because they'd all died from the salt water. And don't you know, 2 years later, we had a drought and that pond dried up again. But the damage in Port Bolivar in Horseshoe Marsh and Bolivar Flats was just amazing. Amazing. I mean, we had stuff in Mundy Marsh, too. We had a lot of vehicles. I didn't know what you do with those, but we figured out eventually. Because what happened was the storm surge came before they expected it. And a lot of people were driving to get off, and they couldn't because the water got too deep, so they abandoned their vehicles, and the storm surge pushed them inland. So we wound up with them in that sanctuary. And Horseshoe Marsh wound up with houses that weren't attached to their pilings well, or pieces of houses. We were cleaning up there one day, and this lady came up to me, and she said, She said, Miss Winnie, she said, can I go get the clothes out of my closet? Because her house was out there. I said, you can take the whole house, and she said she couldn't do that. But there was, it was amazing. And Bolivar Flats was interesting because the natural processes happened. We had, I don't know how many feet of, like 100 feet out, the sand was picked up and pushed inland into the marshes, which changed the marshes. They weren't low marshes anymore. They were high marshes. It moved a lot of things around it, and it brought us things. We had 2 containers from the Port of Houston. They were stainless steel refrigerated containers. They were empty. We got bales of cotton. We got these little wooden things that were like this, pieces of wood with a little angle here. Hundreds of them. And what they are is when they have festivals and things in Galveston and they close parking, they put those everywhere, and they have little signs stapled on them. And the water had come in, came in over the Bolivar Peninsula, and it came out the mouth of the bay and over Galveston Island. So that's why we got stuff that was on the docks in Galveston. And it took down the vehicular barriers, and the observation platform, our observation tower, wound up in Horseshoe Marsh. And it took down all the fences, as you can imagine. And one of the things that was really neat was when we did the fundraising for Bolivar Flats, we had about $100,000 that we put into a management fund. And the agriculture department had a grant program where we could get 75% of fencing money back. But we had to have the fencing done first, and it was a reimbursement program. And so almost nobody could take advantage of it because most people don't have enough money to get it done and get reimbursed. But we had that money, and we used it that way. So that worked out really well. The other 25% we got done with a grant from ConocoPhillips. So it was amazing. One of the things that I loved was the boardwalk. I don't know, have you been to High Island? Okay, so there's an observation platform behind Boy Scout Woods that looks out over the wetlands, the created wetlands project that we did with the school. So that boardwalk was picked up and stacked together like a stack of cards, one piece on top of the other. Well, the guy that works for us, Houston Sliger, used to work for us, common sense kind of guy, he got the tractor out and he just took the pieces, put them back, and fastened them better. So there was all kinds of funny things. We wound up having to get debris out of the woods because the 20-foot, the storm surge was about 20 feet at High Island. It brought a lot of trash up into the woods. And volunteers, honestly, we had phenomenal volunteer days. You really get a good turnout for volunteers if you have things they know they're really needed for, and they knew they were needed. And we had a lot of volunteer days at High Island and at Bolivar Flats because so much boards and things were back in the marsh. It's very nice to see so many people want to help. So Houston Audubon is one of the undivided interest owners in North Deer Island. And North Deer Island used to be the most productive waterbird island in the state. And it was eroding away really rapidly. And people had brought out bags of cement and stuff, but that's not enough. So North Deer, as I said, we own an undivided interest. We own more now than we used to because we just donated a nice chunk of the undivided interest. And I was working for Houston Audubon and Audubon, Texas, the two main owners of the island. And we would go out to North Deer, and North Deer I used to keep a list of things I needed to get done, and North Deer was always at the top. And it was really hard because, I couldn't find anybody who felt like they could do anything. So I went to this meeting in South Padre Island, and I don't remember who was the land commissioner then. Jerry Patterson, maybe. But they had started this new initiative, this erosion initiative. So I thought, aha! And I wrote a letter to the General Land Office and said, this is the most productive island in the state. We know that it's eroding rapidly. There's good records of the erosion. We need somebody to do something. And I got a call from Texas Parks and Wildlife. And they had been assigned to partner with us to get this done. So they raised $3 million. No, $3 million or $7 million, I don't know. Many billions of dollars, more than 5, and got engineering work done, and they did shoreline protection, and they built jetties out, and they did all kinds of stuff which has almost stopped the erosion of the island. And it was wonderful. What we did was they got money that they could get, but there was some money they couldn't get because it had to go to a nonprofit. So I got that money, wrote those grants, and one of them was like $250,000 to a NIFWIF program, I think it was. But we could use their money to match it because it was the same project. So it went very well. And it went, one of the things that happens in conservation is you don't know who can do something. Somebody's got to do something. We knew we couldn't do it because we didn't know where to start. But Texas Parks and Wildlife did, and they did it. It was barge wakes, also subsidence, because North Deer isn't really all that far as the pelican flies from Texas City. And there's a big subsidence area radiating out from Texas City because they use so much groundwater in the refineries. And so it was mostly that, the subsidence and the barge wakes. There really were quite a few islands in Galveston Bay, and almost all of them are gone. North Deer is one of the last natural islands. Most of the islands that exist now were islands that were created with dredge material. And it's interesting, Galveston Bay itself has subsided so much that it now holds 2/3 more water than it did at European contact. And it has to do with subsidence, and also, that they used a tremendous amount of fossil oyster shell to do roads. And so at European contact, Galveston Bay was a clear bay with a hard bottom. And they mined all the hard bottom, which was the oyster shell, for roads.
That's remarkable.
It is. Well, if you go up to Baytown, there was a whole subdivision there that was inundated. So they tore it down, and that's where the Baytown Nature Center is. We're working with Fish and Wildlife Service on Little Pelican Island, which is just adjacent to Pelican Island in Galveston. And that was in about 90 or 91, the first 3 or 4 pelican pairs nested there. That was the first time since the 50s that they nested in Galveston Bay. And so we were keeping an eye on it because I was working with the warden. With my position with Houston Audubon, I tried to get to know the Audubon wardens in Galveston Bay, because they usually are the ones that keep track of colonial water birds. And my father was a warden in Florida, so they're always interesting people. And so we were keeping an eye on, we counted that island for the yearly waterbird census. And they were going great guns, just amazing. And that breeding started to drop off. And we found coyote tracks. Coyotes are terrible bird predators, ground nesting bird predators particularly. So we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we managed to remove coyotes, but then it was pigs, and then it was, coons, and it wasn't very far to swim across the intercoastal from Pelican Island. And with more activity on Pelican Island, more things were moving out they just swim. Even pigs can swim. They have those little skinny feet and they can swim. But so the pelicans moved to North Deer, and they moved in with a vengeance. I mean, it was just amazing how many pairs. I don't know how many pairs are there now, because I'm not involved in that part of things anymore. But when I was still doing censuses, we would get at least 1,000 pairs. And that's a lot of pelicans. As soon as pelicans started to nest in Galveston Bay again, the population exploded, which is very encouraging. It's very encouraging. But one of the things I wanted to mention was in the early 90s, it became very obvious bird numbers were going down because we would see fewer and fewer migrants. And then, I forgot what year it was. Then it was in 2007, two fellas sat down next to me on the bleachers at High Island, and they said that how would we feel about having permanent bird guides in the spring? I said, well, that would be fine. A lot of people propose things to me. I don't get too excited until I know it might actually be something real. They said, well, they had decided that they would buy the house across the street, and in the spring that they would house bird guides there, and that they would lead field trips every day. And so they did, and it was tropical birding. And the wonderful thing was, we knew the numbers of birds were going down. We could almost get sad about it because some days we really didn't have much. But we had all these excited young people who came in and did bird walks and had great following and were enthusiastic. I mean, I can remember Scott Watson coming back one morning. I said, how was the walk this morning? And Scott goes, oh, boy, we saw the best cardinals we've seen in ages. But it did a lot for us to have these professional bird guides, and that was a really wonderful program that we did cooperatively with tropical birding. I think for Houston Audubon it is. If it's continues to go at the rate they're going, they've got this. I basically have stuck to statutory staff on the coast. I don't know a lot of the new people, but you certainly looks from what we see in the webpage and Facebook and stuff that they have a lot of interesting programs going on, and they're diversifying in programming and in the places they're having programs. And I think that we're all, of an age where we know that this next generation has to be approached differently. And I think by getting more of the next generation in on staff, that they're able more to address it. I don't know environmentally, we don't as a society yet, or I don't know if we ever will, have enough appreciation for the importance. I mean, everything tells you if you want to feel better, if you want to do this, you should spend more time in nature, but yet everybody's getting rid of nature, so I don't know what we are with that. But the only way that we can protect it is to have people appreciate it. The gal that was the second in, next to the Secretary of the Department of the Interior came. Now that was a funny thing. Yeah. So we were having that thing downtown somewhere in some, I don't remember, the art museum or something in the auditorium, someplace like that. Anyway, so we were supposed to take these people out bird watching, and we couldn't take them to North Deer because it wouldn't look like anything was like November. So they decided to take them to Bolivar Flats. Well, don't you know, we've got these high mucky bucks in the Department of Interior, and it's raining. And we had purchased our house at Bolivar Flats. This was not long after Ike was like in 2009. So we had this house. We hadn't fixed it up or anything yet, but I got folding chairs, and we sat by my windows. I mean, this is the assistant deputy director of and all these people from Fish and Wildlife Service, and we watched a great blue heron eating a huge catfish. We watched all kinds of bird activity just sitting there in my not very nice looking house. But they all had a great time. And then we had to come back in and have this presentation. And the nice thing is they had done, the Audubon wardens are just amazing guys. Most of them are fishermen or hunters, and they're really attached to the natural world. Some of them do amazing outreach. There was this guy, Chester Smith, in Port O'Connor, and every year he would have somebody kill a rattlesnake, because all the islands a lot of them are full of rattlesnakes. And then he'd hold it up and have a picture taken, and in the local paper it would say, another huge rattlesnake killed on Sundown Island. Well, that kept people off the island if they thought there were huge rattlesnakes, right? And he had a big family, like 6 kids and a gazillion grandkids. And he was so strong about hunting and fishing regulations. But anyway, that's Chester. We had Bob Galloway, who I worked with. And he was another person that, after he'd be out in the boat, he'd be going over to Gilhooly's and having a beer and talking to the guys, and he'd make sure that all the latest colonial waterbird brochures were in all the bars. And think what a good outreach that is. Because that's the fishermen that have just come in and maybe have walked on the islands who shouldn't have. And so they did just a wonderful, Texas Parks and Wildlife did a wonderful video about Bob, which was great. I've gotten to meet a lot of really neat people doing this. Just amazing people who really care a lot about the environment and some of them do phenomenal things for protecting it.